welcome to another far-reaching conversation. Sometimes you just want to cut to the chase, right? Well, that's what we're doing today, giving you the need-to-know info on competition in government contracts. We're talking about the FAR and how it makes sure things are fair when the government goes shopping.
And you might be surprised to learn that the FAR doesn't always demand all-out competition for every single purchase.
Okay, so before we get lost in the weeds, can we start with the basics? When does the FAR actually apply when it comes to competition? I mean, is there ever a time when the government can just skip the whole competitive bidding thing?
That's a great question because, yes, there are absolutely situations where the FAR's rules about competition don't apply.
Really? Like what? Give me the juicy exceptions.
Well, imagine the government needs to make a really small purchase, like office supplies or something. The FAR understands that a full-blown competition would be overkill in that scenario. So for what they call simplified acquisitions, which are covered on FAR 413, there's more flexibility.
So it's like, hey, we need some new staplers. Let's not overthink this.
Exactly. And another exception is when the government already has an existing agreement in place, like a requirements contract with a specific company. If they need more of whatever that contract covers, they might not need to hold a whole new competition.
Makes sense. It's like having a go-to supplier for certain things.
Yeah,
But I'm guessing most of the time the government does have to follow those FAR rules about competition, right?
absolutely. And that takes us to the heart of the matter. What the FAR calls full and open competition, which is laid out in subpart 6.1. This is kind of the gold standard for government contracting.
Okay, so let's break it down. What does full and open competition actually mean? Is it literally anyone and everyone can submit a bid?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. The FAR wants to make sure everyone has a fair chance, but it also needs to ensure that whoever gets the contract can actually do the job. So full and open competition means giving all responsible sources a shot.
Responsible sources. What does that mean exactly?
Think of it as a basic screening process. The government wants to weed out companies that are clearly unqualified or don't have the experience or resources to fulfill the contract requirements. It wouldn't make sense to waste everyone's time evaluating bids from companies that are obviously not up to the task, right?
Right. It's like applying for a job. You need to meet certain qualifications to even be considered. So once the government has identified those responsible sources, how do they actually go about soliciting and evaluating bids?
Well, there are a couple of main procedures outlined in the FAR. One is sealed bidding, which, as you might guess, involves submitting bids in sealed envelopes.
The classic sealed bid. So much suspense.
Indeed. And in this approach, the contract is awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. It's a pretty straightforward process, often used for simpler purchases where price is the primary deciding factor.
So if you're offering the best price and you meet those basic qualifications, you're in good shape. But what about more complex projects where price isn't the only thing that matters?
That's where competitive proposals come in. This is a more elaborate process where the government considers a whole range of factors beyond just the price tag.
Like what?
Well, they might look at the company's experience and past performance, the quality of their proposed solution, their technical capabilities, and even their understanding of the government's specific needs. It's a much more holistic evaluation, designed to find the best overall value, not just the cheapest option.
So it's a bit more like a job interview where you're trying to impress the government with your skills and experience. Okay, so we've got full and open competition on one end of the spectrum, and then those simplified acquisition exceptions on the other. Is there anything in between?
There is. Sometimes the government wants to encourage competition, but also needs to be strategic about who they're letting bid.
Strategic? How so?
Well, they might want to support certain types of businesses or make sure they have multiple sources for critical goods or services.
Interesting. So they're trying to shape the competitive landscape in a way that serves their broader goals.
Exactly. And that brings us to subpart 6.2, which focuses on something called full and open competition after exclusion of sources. Sounds a bit like a contradiction, right?
Yeah. It's like saying, we want competition, but only among these specific players. So when can the government actually exclude certain sources from a competition? What are the rules around that?
The FAR is very specific about this. They can't just exclude companies they don't like or give preferential treatment to their buddies. There have to be legitimate reasons. And these are laid out in FAR 6.202.
Okay, give us some examples. What are some of those legitimate reasons for excluding sources?
Well, one reason might be national security. If a particular project involves sensitive information or technology, the government might limit the competition to companies that have the necessary security clearances or meet certain vetting requirements.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want just anyone bidding on a top secret project.
Exactly. Another reason might be the need to establish or maintain alternative sources for critical supplies or services.
So they don't want to be reliant on just one company for something really important, especially in emergencies.
Right. Think about something like a pandemic or a natural disaster. If the government only has one supplier for a critical medical device or a vital piece of infrastructure, they're in a very vulnerable position. So they might strategically exclude certain sources to encourage other companies to develop the capacity to provide those goods or services, creating more resilience in the system.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling reason.
Right.
What other situations might justify excluding sources?
Well, sometimes the government wants to support certain types of businesses, like small businesses or businesses owned by veterans or minorities. They might exclude larger companies from competing for certain contracts to give these smaller businesses a better chance of winning.
So they're using their purchasing power to promote diversity and inclusion in the marketplace.
Exactly. And this ties into the concept of set-asides, which are specifically designed to create opportunities for those designated groups.
Set-asides. Tell me more about those better.
Essentially, a set-aside means reserving certain contracts for businesses that meet specific criteria. So, for example, the government might have a set-aside program for women-owned small businesses, meaning that only businesses that meet that definition are eligible to compete for those particular contracts.
So it's like creating a special lane in a race to give certain runners a head start.
That's a good analogy. It's all about leveling the playing field and ensuring that businesses that might otherwise struggle to compete have a chance to succeed in the government marketplace.
Okay, so we've got these situations where the government can exclude sources for strategic reasons, but what about those times when full competition just isn't feasible at all?
6.302 lays out very specific circumstances where the government might be able to limit or even eliminate competition. And for each of these exceptions, there are strict requirements for justification and approval.
Okay, let's get into the details. What are some of the most common scenarios where full competition might not be possible?
Well, one of the most common exceptions is when there's literally only one company that can provide what the government needs. Maybe they have a unique technology, a specialized skill set, or they're the sole manufacturer of a critical component.
So if there's no competition, there's no competition. It makes sense that they wouldn't force a competition if it's just going to be one company bidding on the contract. But how do they ensure they're not missing a potential source? What if there's a small company out there that could do the job, but they just don't have the same name recognition as the big players?
You bring up a great point. To avoid overlooking any potential competitors, the FAR requires the government to conduct thorough market research before deciding to go with a sole source contract. They have to actively search for other companies that might be able to meet their needs, even if they're not the usual suspects.
So they can't just assume there's only one option. They have to put in the effort to verify that. I like it. What other situations might allow for limited competition?
Another big one is unusual and compelling urgency, which is covered under FAR 6.302-2. This comes into play when time is of the essence, and any delays in awarding a contract could seriously harm the government's interests.
Okay, give me a real-world example. When would this exception actually be used?
Think about a natural disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake. In those situations, the government needs to act fast to provide emergency relief. And waiting for a competitive bidding process to play out could cost lives. They might need to quickly procure things like food, water, shelter, medical supplies, or even debris removal services.
So in those cases, speed trumps everything else.
Right. But even with this exception, the FAR has some pretty strict rules. The contracting officer has to document a clear justification for using this authority. And the total period of performance for the contract can't exceed 1 year unless there are truly extraordinary circumstances.
So they can't just use urgency as an excuse to hand out no-bid contracts for years on end.
Exactly. And another important exception is the national security exception, outlined in FAR 6.3026.
Ooh, that one sounds intriguing. What kind of situations would fall into that category?
Well, this exception is used when the government needs to keep its requirements secret to protect national security. It could involve things like developing classified technologies, procuring sensitive equipment, or even conducting covert operations.
Okay, so we're talking about top secret stuff, where revealing the government's needs could put national security at risk.
Exactly. And in these cases, the government might limit competition to a very small group of pre-vetted companies that have the necessary security clearances and can be trusted with sensitive information.
So it's a delicate balance between protecting national security and ensuring that the contracting process is as competitive as possible.
Precisely. There are a few other situations where the FAR allows for limited competition.
Okay, what are those?
Well, one is for international agreements. Sometimes the government might have a treaty obligation to procure certain goods or services from a specific country or company.
So it's like a diplomatic arrangement where they're bound by an international agreement.
Exactly. And another one is when Congress passes a law that specifically directs the government to buy something from a particular source.
So Congress might say, the government shall purchase all of its office supplies from this company and no other.
It doesn't usually happen with office supplies, but you get the idea. There might be specific policy objectives behind those directives, like supporting a particular industry or promoting a social cause.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm guessing there's also a catch-all exception for those really unique situations that don't fit neatly into any of the other categories.
You know the FAR too well. There is a provision that allows the agency head to waive the competition requirements if they determine that it's not in the public interest.
That sounds like it gives them a lot of leeway.
It does, but
Yeah.
it's rarely used. It's typically reserved for those truly exceptional circumstances where the other exceptions don't apply, and there's a very compelling reason to limit competition.
And I'm guessing there's a whole process of justification and approval to prevent anyone from abusing that authority?
Absolutely. The agency head would have to document their rationale in writing and submit it to Congress for review. So there's a high level of accountability, even in those rare cases.
What about situations where the government goes above and beyond to encourage competition?
Well, sometimes, even when they could justify limiting competition, they see the value in opening it up. It can lead to better solutions, lower costs, and a fairer process overall.
Okay, I like that. So can you give me an example?
Let's say the government needs a new software system for managing HR. They could probably just go with the company they've used before.
Right, a sole source award.
Yeah, but instead they might decide to put out a request for information to a bunch of different companies just to see what's out there.
So they're doing some market research.
Exactly. And they might find that there are some really great options out there, maybe even from some smaller companies they hadn't considered before.
So by opening it up to competition, they're not only getting a wider range of ideas, but they're also potentially helping to level the playing field for those smaller businesses.
Exactly. And sometimes they might even choose to do a limited competition, even when a sole source would be justifiable. It's a way to compare different approaches and maybe get a better deal in the end.
So competition becomes a strategic tool, a way to drive innovation and get the most bang for their buck.
Right.
This has been a really great overview of competition in government contracting.
I'm glad you found it helpful. It's a topic that affects all of us as taxpayers.
Absolutely. And for anyone out there who wants to dive even deeper, there's a wealth of information available online.
You can find government websites, industry publications, even online courses that break it all down.
That's a great point. And don't forget about those experts out there, attorneys, consultants, folks, who can give you personalized guidance.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me on this dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for listening, and please reach for that subscribe button.